Hey, how's it going? So, politicians love oil. Selling it generates easy money for governments that's much easier than just taxing citizens. Those citizens might then demand services, democracy, and good governance. Petrodollars also lubricate patronage networks. They can be used to buy votes, silence rivals, and if that fails, they can fund a comfortable retirement abroad. So, when the price of oil fell by about 30% on March 9th to below about $32 a barrel, a lot of politicians were upset. Oil prices crashed because COVID-19 cut global demand and Saudi Arabia opened its taps to crush high-cost oil producers. The consequences for other oil-pumping nations is going to be economic pain and hard choices. The pain is going to be felt in broad areas over the Middle East and in Africa. A rehearsal of this took place in 2014 when oil prices fell by more than half. This time is going to be tougher since countries burned through a lot of their cash reserves during that crash. The most immediate impact is going to be on government budgets. Now, if we start in Nigeria, where oil accounts for roughly 90% of exports and 2/3 of government revenue, the finance minister there has already called for a review of the budget, which is based on an oil price of about $57 a barrel. But austerity is going to prove really difficult in an economy so slow that it's barely keeping pace with population growth. There's little space for borrowing. About 65% of government revenues go to servicing existing debt. Now, and a Nigerian economist assumes that the government is simply going to print more money to pay its civil servants, and that's then going to stoke inflation. The oil price war is going to make a mess of public finances in other parts of the Gulf, too. Oman's 2020 budget predicted a deficit of about 8% of GDP, even with oil at $58 a barrel. Prices at $30 a barrel would send the deficit as high as 22%. Bahrain, a small producer that doesn't really rely on oil for relies on oil for about 75% of its public revenue, well, Bahrain hopes to balance its budget by 2020. Both countries are probably going to have to cut spending and borrow money. Their debt loads have soared a lot since 2014, when years of $100 plus per barrel of oil ended. Oman now owes more than 60% of its gross domestic product, up from about 5% in 2014, while Bahrain's debt load jumped from 44% to about 105%. Wealthier countries can kind of waddle through this for years. Saudi Arabia had budgeted for a $50 billion deficit in 2020. Goldman Sachs, a bank, thinks it can now surpass $80 billion, and other economists put the hole at about $100 billion. But Saudi Arabia has about $500 billion in its central bank, and it can borrow cheaply with 10-year bonds trading at yields of less than 4%. Now, Saudi debt is 24% of gross domestic product. That's low by global standards, but it's a big increase from 2014 when the kingdom owed less than 2% of its gross domestic product. A lot of this debt is really unproductive. Gulf states are borrowing to sustain current, really high levels of spending. The new Sultan of Oman, Haitham, who took power in January after his cousin's death, wants to give out more money. Dubai, part of the United Arab Emirates, has an expansionary budget that's meant to kickstart a weak economy. Some of this is now going to have to be scaled back. Expats in Dubai are already being hit by layoffs and salary cuts. Contractors in Saudi Arabia are worried that the government is going to start delaying payments like it did during the last oil price slump. Now, these low oil prices are going to be even more hurtful in Iraq, which relies on oil for 90% of government revenue. Iraq is gripped by political paralysis right now. There are months of protests that brought down the government back in October, and the designated prime minister, Mohammed Tafi Ali, failed to form a new government. His predecessor raised public spending by 45% last year and doubled the deficit. Almost half of the spending is on public sector wages and pensions. With oil cheap, the state can't make its own payroll. In the long term, a sustained fall in the price of oil is not going to be a bad thing for states in the Middle East and Africa if it pushes them to diversify. Though oil makes up a huge proportion of exports and government revenue in countries like Angola and Nigeria, neither of them is a big producer when measured per person. Nigeria really needs to get out of its oil dependency. It should be investing in things like education, health, and infrastructure. The president of Angola, who took over in about 2017, has focused on lowering the cost for producers. But producing oil in Angola is really far from being cheap. Now, these Gulf states talk a lot about diversification, but their business cycles are still hostage to oil prices. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and basically the ruler of Saudi Arabia, has big plans to invest in everything from tourism to tech. Foreign direct investment in the kingdom, though, is already really weak. because of worries about Prince Mohammed's really kind of sketchy rule. Confidence isn't going to be boosted by his surprise oil price war. Back in the United Arab Emirates, perhaps the most successfully diversified oil economy, the main alternative to crude is tourism, and that provides 12% of gross domestic product. But this COVID-19 outbreak has scared off a lot of visitors. So, with less money around, African and Middle Eastern leaders are going to find it harder to keep their people happy. In Angola elections in 2022, there's going to be a real big challenge. In Nigeria, the head of Kano, which is a former central bank governor and critic of President Muhammadu Buhari's economic policies, well, he was dethroned on March 9th for showing insubordination to local authorities. Just before the oil prices crashed, the authorities in Saudi Arabia arrested several influential royals, including Ahmed bin Abdelaziz, the king's brother. In the absence of black gold and oil, some of these strongmen are also going to turn down, and they're going to have an iron fist.